The USS Johnston, DD-557, was a Fletcher-class destroyer built for the United States Navy during World War II. She was commissioned on October 27, 1943, in Seattle, Washington, and named after Civil War First Master Lieutenant John V. Johnston, who participated in the Marshall and Mariana Islands campaigns in the Pacific Ocean. Her greatest achievement was the sinking of the Japanese submarine I-176 before she perished and sank after coming under attack by enemy battleships and cruiser forces during the Battle of Samar. Throughout the assault on October 25, 1944, the centremost action of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, one of the largest naval battles in history, the USS Johnston fell after she and other US Navy ships saved most of their fellow carriers and prevented Japanese forces from reaching the Leyte invasion area. Remarkably, in 2019, 75 years later, the destroyer was discovered by the RV Petrel research vessel owned by the United States Navy and once owned by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen. In March 2021, a privately funded expedition by two former US Navy officers was commissioned and conducted using the DSV limiting factor submarine, which located, observed, and filmed the fallen destroyer. So what happened to the USS Johnston? How did she meet her fate during the turbulent years of World War II? And how was she finally found? Join us as we dive deeper into the tragic case of the USS Johnston. Let us begin our timeline by noting that the USS Johnston was laid down the 6th of May, 1942 by the Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding Company in Seattle, Washington. Not long after taking to the waters, the Johnston stormed the shores of Kwajalein, part of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, during a 5-day siege of Eniwetok from 17th to the 22nd of February 1944. The Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaign was a series of battles conducted in the Pacific theater of World War II between the United States and Japan, and was the beginning of the movement across the Central Pacific by the United States Pacific Fleet and Marine Corps. During a patrol duty in the Solomon Islands on the 28th of March, she attacked Kapinga Marangi Atoll in the Carolines. After destroying many outposts and infrastructure in the regions, the USS Johnston took up an anti-submarine patrol mission off Bougainville, part of Papua New Guinea. It was during this time that on the 16th of May, she assisted in the depth-charge destruction of the Japanese submarine I-176. The underwater craft was heavily active during the war years and was spotted by a US patrol plane, which called upon the Johnston and fellow destroyers, USS Franks, DD-554, and USS Haggard, DD-555. All three boats headed to the scene. The Haggard made a sonar contact and began dropping depth charges, whilst the other destroyers carried out a series of depth charge attacks that continued for several hours. On the morning of the 17th, the Allied naval forces found evidence of the destruction of the submarine. There were no survivors. Returning to the timeline of events, the USS Johnston continued its patrol duties in the Solomon Islands, before setting sail to the Marshalls again, in preparation for the attempted capture of Guam, the island territory in Micronesia, in the Western Pacific. The invasion began on the 21st of July 1944, after the destroyer united with the USS Pennsylvania. After carrying out a major operation and assault on the region, destroying many outposts, artillery, and resources, Johnston began an escorting mission to provide protection and movement for aircraft carriers during the subsequent battle and capture of the Palau Islands. She then sailed across eastern Leyte and the Gulf on her journey towards the Philippines. She began her trek on the 12th of October, again providing assistance and protective aid to US troops, destroying any vehicles or convoys that stood in their way on the road of Leyte. During the campaign, she operated with Taffy 3, one of the three units of Rear Admiral Thomas L. Sprague's Escort Carrier Task Group, known by their voice calls Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Despite its successful run of missions and accomplishments, the day would come when the 2,100-ton destroyer, whose nickname was GQ Johnny, would fall at the hands of Japanese forces. On the morning of the 23rd of October, 1944, US naval submarines came into conflict with Japanese units. This battle would continue over the course of 2 days, when, on the early morning of the 25th, the Japanese Center Force fleet navigated through the San Bernardino Strait. American pilots spotted their approach. a mammoth faction consisting of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, and approximately 12 destroyers, all of which were heading directly towards Taffy 3. The USS Johnston began its maneuvering capabilities in an attempt to dodge the Japanese fleet, generating smokescreen cover over a distance of 2,500 yards to prevent enemy gunners from hitting their target. The Johnston made its daring and brave counterattack, charging towards a line of 7 destroyers and 4 Japanese cruisers before taking on their battleships. However, another set of cruisers and destroyers appeared from the east. Though she was wholly outnumbered and flanked in every direction, Johnston took out the nearest cruiser, proceeding to fire more than 200 rounds at their enemy before Commander Evans ordered the firing of torpedoes. After launching 10 torpedoes, they noticed that the Japanese cruiser, Kumano, was severely damaged and would subsequently sink. This small victory was short-lived, as she immediately took 3 14-inch shell hits from one of the battleships, before another 3 6-inch shells struck her from an enemy light cruiser. This rapid bombardment of hits rendered the destroyer powerless with regard to the steering engine, 5-inch guns, and gyro compass. At 7:50 am, Admiral Sprague ordered another torpedo attack. However, all of the destroyer's torpedoes had been used. At 8:20 am, a 30,000-ton Congo-class battleship appeared out of the clouds of smoke and was within 7,000 yards of Johnston, to which the response was to open fire and hit as much of its structure as humanly possible. At this point, crew members noticed that the Casablanca-class escort carrier Gambier Bay was under significant gunfire from an enemy cruiser. Commander Evans gave the following order: "Commence firing on that cruiser. Draw her fire on us and away from Gambier Bay." She fought hard, fending off the entire Japanese destroyer squadron, pushing them back until their remaining units re-navigated in an attempt to launch a new flurry of torpedoes. At this point, she took a direct hit, disabling her front gun and causing extensive damage to the ammunition lockers, bridge, and remaining gunnery due to rapid explosions and fireballs. Despite the colossal damage on the destroyer's frame, the crew continued to battle on, their courage undeterred by the fleet of Japanese ships closing in on them. At 9:30 am, she was rendered dead in the water, losing all power as the enemy circled her and proceeded to initiate more attacks on the structure. At 9:45 am, Admiral Evans gave the heartbreaking command to abandon ship. Less than half an hour later, the USS Johnston turned on her side and began to sink into the oceans below. As she sank, the captain and crew of the Japanese destroyer Yuki Kazi sailed past Johnston and saluted her, a mark of respect, despite the ferocious battle that had just ensued. Of the 327 that were aboard the USS Johnston, only 141 were saved. Of 186 lost, approximately 50 were killed by enemy action. 45 died on rafts from battle injuries, and 91 were never heard from again. Commander Ernest E. Evans was also observed abandoning the ship in a lifeboat, but also disappeared and was presumed dead. He was, however, awarded a posthumous Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the US Navy, and only one of 2 destroyer captains in World War II to receive the distinction. A surviving crew member stated that the skipper was a fighting man from the soles of his broad feet to the ends of his straight black hair. He was an Oklahoman and proud of the Indian blood he had in him. We called him, though not to his face, the Chief. The Johnston was a fighting ship, but he was her heart and soul. Johnston's courage and tenacity during the Battle of Samar also won her the Presidential Unit Citation as a unit of Taffy 3. It must also be said that the USS Howell, DD 533, and USS Samuel B. Roberts, DE 113, also sacrificed themselves during that day in an attempt to protect the escort carriers. Their assistance through air and surface attacks resulted in the sinking of 2 out of 4 Japanese heavy cruisers. And just like that, the USS Johnston was gone, never to be seen or heard of again. Or was she? A mission sponsored by undersea technology company Caledon Oceanic and headed up by entrepreneur, explorer, and retired naval officer Victor Vescovo, first located the USS Johnston on the edge of an undersea cliff in October 2019 via the research vessel Petrel. The RV, which belongs to the private-held company Vulcan Inc., announced that they had indeed found a section of wreckage belonging to the Great Destroyer. Retired Naval History and Heritage Command Rear Admiral Sam Cox stated that the image is impressive, and we look forward to seeing the rest of the data collected during the expedition, because the story of the Fletcher-class destroyer USS Johnston and her crew is a perfect example for modern sailors of the honour, courage, commitment and valour of their predecessors from the greatest generation. He went on to discuss and detail his admiration for those who fought in the doomed battle, describing the sheer raw courage of the commanding officers and crews of 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, and the pilots and air crewmen flying off slow escort carriers. The Naval History and Heritage Command is located at the Washington Navy Yard and is responsible for the preservation, analysis, and dissemination of US naval history and heritage. Cox and his associates would provide and maintain historical resources and products relative to the US Navy's contributions throughout history, aiding and promoting the Marine Forces with qualified and competent research, analysis, and translative services. The NHHC houses various divisions within its command, including the Navy Operational Archives, the Navy Art and Artifact Collections, Underwater Archaeology, the USS Constitution Repair Facility, the historic ship Nautilus, and the Navy Department Library. The mission to detect, locate, and scan the ruins of the destroyer was a massive task. She was found at more than 20,000 feet, and thus it was declared to be the deepest shipwreck ever discovered. Once the detection and discovery were made under the waters, the Naval History and Heritage Command assessed the wreckage in great detail and initially declared that a structure similar to the USS Hoel was examined. Eventually Vescovo located Johnston's bow further down the cliff face at approximately 21,180 feet. Victor Vescovo was very clear in his discussions with the NHHC about preserving the wreckage and ensuring that any and all studies of sonar imagery and investigative data were conducted with respect to Johnston, her crew, and her final resting place. Vescovo stated clearly that we have a strict look, don't touch policy, and that I believe it is important work, which is why I fund it privately, and we deliver the material to the Navy pro bono. The entrepreneur kept to his word, as at the end of the expedition and deep dive to find the USS Johnston, the Caledon Oceanic team brought their surface vessel, DSSV Pressure Drop, to a stop in the vicinity of the battle, sounded the ship's whistle, and laid a wreath in honour for those who lost their lives that day. Having been in the Navy himself, Vescovo was understandably wholly committed and invested in the project, as well as emotional when he stated that, in some ways, we have come full circle. The Johnston and our ship were built in the same shipyard and both served in the US Navy. As a US Navy officer, I'm proud to have helped bring clarity and closure to the Johnston, its crew, and the families of those who fell there. With this heartfelt declaration by Vescovo, it is probably best to end our episode of Maritime Mysteries here, as we continue to learn more about what happened to the men, women, and children who lived through and died during the great battles that shaped our history. Whether on land, air, or sea, we find that every story becomes more prominent each year. As for the USS Johnston, its story, demise, and eventual recovery is fascinating, and the fact that Japanese forces saluted her as she and those who fought on her perished on that fateful day in October 1944 is a testament to her structural prowess and the courage and bravery of those who served on her. It goes without saying that, now that she has finally been found, she will continue to tell her story in the hearts and minds of those who survived her, and in the expeditions that excite and fascinate those tasked with keeping her memory alive. This has been Maritime Mishaps. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week for another video.